Hi everyone, on behalf of Doing Sociology, I welcome all of you to this online panel discussion on sociology of childhood issues and challenges. We are an independent, non-funded and women-led team of sociologists from India. Today, we have with us three esteemed panelists who will speak to us on various issues and challenges within the sociology of childhood. Let me introduce the speakers first. Hia Sen. Hia Sen is an assistant professor at the Department of Sociology, Presidency University, Kolkata. She has been teaching at Presidency University since 2012, following the completion of her PhD from the University of Freiburg. Her involvement with research connected to childhood spans over a decade. Her doctoral research that was published as Time Out in the Land of Apu, Childhood's Bildungsmortarium and the Middle Classes of West Bengal by Springer Berlin in 2013 examined the ways in which ideas of childhood intersected with the experiences of children from middle class backgrounds. This and her subsequent works foreground issues confronting scholars working on Southern childhoods. Since then, she has worked on an ICSSR-funded project on the children's theatre scene in India. Her current research is located within the history of childhood, wherein she looks at the presence of children from India in missionary networks. Our second panelist is Dr. Anandini Dar, who is a faculty of Sociology and Education at the Dr. B.R. Ambedkar University, Delhi, AUD, India. She is the founder and co-convener of the Critical Childhoods and Youth Studies Collective in India, and also serves as an advisory board member of the Childism Institute, Rutgers University, USA. Her research interests include issues of everyday lives, cultures, rights, politics, and identities of young people in the context of migration, displacement, and globalization. She has conducted a multi-sited ethnography with South Asian immigrant teenagers growing up in a post-9/11 USA as part of her doctoral work. Currently, she is working on a cross-disciplinary project examining the placemaking processes and well-being of children and families in 2 informal settlements in Delhi, India. This project is in collaboration with architects and social scientists in the UK, Norway, and Finland. Dr. Dar is the principal investigator for the India project. Her research cuts across disciplines of childhood studies, education, development studies, and feminist studies. And she has also worked in the NGO sector and academia across 3 continents, America, Australia, and Asia. She has published in national and international reports, peer-reviewed journals, and is currently editing 2 book volumes on topics related to childhood, modernity, and development with Rutledge, India, and UK, respectively. Our third panelist is Smruthi Bala Kannan, who is a PhD candidate with the Department of Childhood Studies at Rutgers-Camden. Her doctoral work focuses on adolescent students' lived experiences of cleanliness discourses in schools in the context of Tamil Nadu, India. She is interested in researching and learning about young people's diverse and intergenerational negotiations between public health and environmental sustainability in their everyday lives. She was awarded a fellowship for the 2020-21 Institute for Research on Women's Seminar, Knowing Bodies, Science, and the Sex-Gender Distinction. I welcome all 3 of you to the panel discussion, as well as the audience who have joined in from various corners of the world. So, just to begin the discussion, and because sociology of childhood is something new and exciting for all of us to talk and listen to, I would like to know how you'd locate yourselves as sociologists and childhood studies scholars, and where do you see the 2 domains overlapping, and how do you situate yourselves in that convergence?
Anandini, would you like to start, or Shruti?
Go ahead, Hia.
Okay. Thanks. So first of all, thank you, Rituparna and Deepali, for having us on this platform. It's an honor to be here. With regard to the question of how we locate ourselves, so how I locate myself, to be very honest, in terms of training and in terms of employment, I've always moved from one department of sociology to another. And of course, so I was in JNU from 2005 to 2008. MA MPhil, and then at the Institute of Sociology in Freiburg from 2009 to 12. Um, so, well, of course, this long association with the discipline also means that a lot of the fundamental post-independence sociological categories which predominated Indian sociology as it was done and taught, that has rubbed off on, that did rub off onto how I saw things, how I try to process things. Um, so in that sense, I'm all right with the identity of being ensconced in sociology to a certain extent. But that being said, especially from around 2007, I didn't think that my interest in either children or childhood could be met within the discipline, or at least the discipline that I knew of then as sociology. And childhood studies seemed to be a conversation between a community that was happening afar. So unlike Anandini and Smruti's trajectories, who at one point became sort of housed within that institutional space of a childhood studies department, for me, it was always something I was listening to from a distance. And most seductive for me was the insistence that the conviction that childhood studies scholars then had that what children did could be made the center of one's research. And apart from listening to children's voices, looking at children's actions, childhood itself could be at the forefront of one's analysis without essentially slipping into, to borrow from Cath Weston's phrase, being a hermeneutic signpost for something else, right? And that to me seemed very, very important. I had in 2008, a year before I left for Freiburg, I had appeared for a scholarship interview, which I did not get, by the way. And at the interview, when I expressed an interest in childhood and in kind of studying childhood, the interviewers had asked me a couple of questions about texts I was familiar with. I was not familiar with any of the texts they mentioned. And two of them were, if I now remember correctly, Lay and Minton's Rajputs of Kalapur, the Rajputs of Kalapur, and Beatrice Whiting's the Six Culture Studies. I don't know if anyone here would even remember these works. They came out, yeah. So, well, of course you would. But in the 1950s, Harvard and Yale had undertaken this massive, massive, ambitious project of, doing statistical analysis also, as well as using psychological tools and variables of comparing child rearing cultures in India, Mexico, Okinawa, Kenya, Philippines, and I may be forgetting another place. And of course, I mean, to a certain extent, to some of the Delhi academics, it also seemed like this was the kind of work a young researcher, a young student of sociology here had to acquaint herself with if she had to say or do anything with childhood at all, right? And of course, we can talk about this later, maybe at the tail end of this conversation. But much of this work was also not about what children did, and that very attractive conversation was happening at an elsewhere. So, but when I went to Germany, again, I think much of my work there has been in isolation because most people around me did not work on childhood, or if they did, they came from fields of history of education or Sozialpädagogik, which were also very different and very strongly inflected by a rights discourse at that point of time. 2009 was, I think, when the rights discourse was finally petering out, but it was still very much there. So what I do take away from childhood studies, and maybe I can talk about what I did for my doctoral research later, was this abiding interest in centering children, centering childhood, using some of the categories like generational location, trying to unpack what chronological age or relative age meant in certain contexts. But there also, I mean, over the years, the shine of CS also wore off for me. One was, and maybe again, this is something which will come up when Smruthi and Anandini talk. There was also this very swaggery constructivist sort of canon at that point of time, whereby Southern scholars like me, we had a high chance of being typecast because what we were bringing to the field was diversity in terms of other empirical sides of children's lives. And that was not a very good corner to paint oneself in either. So I think I sit not very comfortably with either of these identities of sociology and childhood studies. But of course, I don't think childhood studies is also something which is extraneous to sociology. In a certain sense, it always existed. When it existed, it was in a fragmentary way. It was present in different disciplines like history, anthropology, education. And what I do now, again, something I can talk about later, I would not really situate very neatly into, anthropology or sociology or that kind of work. So I work in children's theater. Another thing which I do is work with the missionary sources from the 1920s and 30s. So I don't think what I do qualifies as sociology of childhood in that sense. So I think maybe the others can jump in now.
Yeah, Anandini and Smruthi, if you could, answer the same question.
Sure, definitely. Thanks, Rituparna, and for bringing us together in Dipali, for rescheduling this event because we were not well. And hence, I thank all the participants here today also for having, taken stock of that change date and still made it today. So feel really glad to see some very familiar names around here and some new ones. So, Rituparna, when you asked that question, it ended with this point around how do we situate ourselves in their convergence. So, the question itself to me suggests an acceptance of, the convergence and the interdisciplinary nature of these disciplines and domains. And I don't entirely disagree with this either. It was sociology that led me to childhood studies in the first place. When I first encountered sociology, the sociology of childhood literature, whether it would be William Corsaro's work or Prout and James and others who were writing at the time. And so that helped me complete a master's thesis on the contestations and complexities of child abuse cases in the Aborigines, indigenous communities in Australia, because that's where I was doing my MA, and I had come across some very critical and not so critical responses to the incidences of increase in child abuse in these communities amongst just the academic community listservs as well. And I was looking at how media constructs culture within which children's bodies and lives are also located, and they get read through those vectors. This was under a guidance of Professor Helen Lee, who was an anthropologist of childhood, working with Tongan children at the time. So I was able to, learn a lot about sociology of childhood in particular, not so much about childhood studies at the time. And it was only when I returned back to, India, I feel I also have a third identity in addition to sociologists and childhood study scholars, that of having worked in the children's rights sector. I came to realize the kinds of challenges that these universalized principles that cater to the deficit model of child of these young children. I, realized that it was much of my later studies actually that helped me make sense of these convergences when I saw it played out on the ground as well. At the time, though, I was quite narrow focused in a sense, so seduced by, as Hia was saying, this sort of glamour of these separation and pushing away of these individual disciplines. So I did not want to do little work with the children's rights sector, wanting to pursue a PhD in a department of childhood studies, which meant that I could be multidisciplinary. I did not have to be bound by the domains of the field, discipline of sociology and its sort of all its facets, which includes where and how it came to be, how it produces knowledge, what are some of the key principles through which it is able to shape knowledge. So it was, much later through my PhD work that I also began to, and later work of teaching in India. So teaching particularly in sociology and education, that, different histories of sociology of childhood also exist across the West. And if we think of much of the UK sociology of childhood, we find a lot of convergence with children's rights movements. So one of the pioneer of the Save the Children movement was, Eggleston Jebb, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, who started Save the Children in the UK. And many of these universalized, internationally supported organizations also exist elsewhere, of course. And in the US, one finds there is no rights discourse at all in childhood studies. Rather, it's full of scholarship around childhood and pure play and culture, family life. Of course, now more on race and childhood has emerged. And whereas in Germany, it's said it's somehow most clear, almost closely associated to German sociology as well. So these trajectories I have only now begun to understand of how they emerge, how they intersect. And my location in these fields, I think, gets prioritized mostly by the location of my work. So whether I'm doing, and I'll talk about my research later, as the next question also, is geared more towards that. But if I am doing global research on childhood versus some work in specific local contexts, they may still be theoretically linked and connected. And I think each, more than sort of figuring a specific location vis-a-vis these disciplines or domains, I think what we need to turn in each of these intersecting domains is a form of, excavating epistemic pluralism. And this concept I'm drawing on from some Latin American decolonial scholars and thinkers who have talked about shifting the center of knowledge from the West to other vectors of knowing. And I think the overlap, the convergence can emerge when we have these kinds of theoretical pluralities possible in these fields, which will also help it grow, I think, to some extent. And I hope I haven't jumped on to some things that we may be discussing later, but I'll hold off for now. And Smruthi, it's your turn.
Thank you so much, Anandini, and thanks a lot again. Thank you, Rituparna and Dipali, for having me as a part of this panel. I'm honored and elated to join you. And Anandini and Hia, talking with you about this topic has been and continues to be thrilling. So, and also Rituparna, thank you for the glorious introduction, actually. So I was thinking of starting by saying I'm not an expert in sociology or childhood studies, but I just want to provide this disclaimer that I hope to speak from the point of view of a graduate student who is currently exploring the field and trying to learn. So my interest in sociology and childhood studies came from the other direction that Hia and Anandini described, where my interest in young people's lives brought me to engage more actively with the discipline of sociology and the key debates in it. And I think I'm also asking constantly, what are the contours of sociology? What forces determine it and shape it? And also, what are the contours of childhood studies and what forces determine and shape it? And this is a concern that has been central to my work prior to as well as within research. So my introduction to sociology as a field was in and through 3 introductory courses in undergraduate education in humanities and social sciences. I learned about some of the key debates and theorists in the field and thinkers who influenced the study of modern societies at large and India in particular. I went on to major and finish a master's in English studies with a focus on post-colonial material narratives. So I came to childhood studies following my work with schools and young people researching curriculum and education policy implementation, actually. So at this point, I was thinking with a post-colonial theory framework in the back of my mind because of my training in undergraduate and master's education. So when I encountered the complexities of young people's everyday life worlds in relation to school in a post-colonial context, which was in Tamil Nadu, I wanted to do more focused research on this topic, which simultaneously looks at the sociology of young people, but also historicize the context within which this was happening. So that is what took me to my current doctoral work in childhood studies and the pursuit of research that is both simultaneously ethnographic and works across disciplines, including that of history. So my research now is advised by Dr. Sharada Balagopalan at Rutgers-Camden with the Department of Childhood Studies. Including her work, many scholars I study across fields draw from multiple disciplines to question, complicate, and problematize assumptions about young people's relationships with institutions such as schools, NGOs, and public policy. So what this training and research space has helped me is to ask questions related to central debates in fields including sociology, such as the tension between individual agency and structure, flows of power and subjectivation, and social variables that shape young people's everyday lives. So this has been my journey to the overlap between and the sort of enmeshing between childhood studies and sociology.
Right. Thank you for those responses. The next question is again addressed to the 3 of you, and it is related to the previous question. So what are the disciplinary how do you frame your academic and academic and professional journey in relation to the sociology of childhood? If the 3 of you could answer that, and Dr. Sen, if you could begin.
Thank you so much, Dipali. Well, if I start with the academic journey, maybe I would fast forward a little bit to my doctoral research. So my initial idea when I started out was that I was going to be using ethnography, and I had it all mapped out, or so I thought, and I was going to be looking at children from children's everyday lives as it played out within the Bengali middle class in Calcutta and one town, Bandel, the suburbs. And of course, this was the initial rough blueprint of what I wanted to do. But what it later became, and maybe many of these tensions I could not articulate very directly then in my work, I tried setting up what I saw was a conversation between many different scholarly fields. And one strand of the conversation was, I think questions of funding and disciplinary allegiances also need to be addressed here. So I went as an Erasmus Mundus scholar, and it was a 3-year program. And although no one said anything outright, but since the proposal had a certain structure, I assumed I should show somehow that I had benefited from my 3 years in Europe, and that should reflect in some way in my work, apart from just using infrastructure. And also my work, of course, had to be grounded in South Asia, because that was the role I thought was ascribed to me. Yeah. So it took me a while to learn German and enter the academic debates which were playing out in the field of social pedagogy and sociology. So I did miss many of the backgrounds. So Jürgen Zinecker's work was something which I started with. And of course, I did not know the history of his work, but Zinecker in the 1980s, he had done this project, Project Siegerland, it was called, where they had mapped out the notion of protected childhoods in certain parts of Western Germany, right? And it was exciting, but by the time I was in Freiburg, it had already, I mean, this idea of childhood as a Bildungsmoratorium, it had already died out. It had anyway enjoyed very limited attention in German education research. The other strands that I was constantly sort of playing with at the institute, most of the other graduate scholars were working with or through Bourdieu or Michael Fester, like milieu studies, working on tastes, dispositions, habitus or habitus-like categories. And this is also something which I felt compelled to in some way, not really strong-armed, but somehow felt obligated to engage with. And I had already come with an armory of sociological categories from my training at the BA, MA, and MPhil level. So in 2005, 2007, these were also the times when there were a lot of works being published in India about the new Indian middle class, the generation which had come of age a decade after liberalization. So these were some of the conversations I was weaving in my way in and out of, and also trying to simultaneously engage with works on the social history of Bengal's middle classes post in the colonial times and post-liberalization. So this is what I thought I was doing. And I think many of the works which I encountered at that point of time also in some way or the other informed what I wanted to do. So I did want to make children's agency visible. Again, something which is very contentious, we can talk about later. But I did want to foreground what children did, but I also wanted to unpack, or maybe I'll take a detour. So if you look at the 25 years roundtable of the journal Childhood, which is a good way of looking at sociology of childhood or childhood studies history over the decades, you will see that one of the earliest Southern childhood scholars who also served as an editor of the journal Childhood, Irene Rizzini, she says, I was rather tired of being the only Southern voice and of speaking on behalf of the South. And she also talks about a larger academic scape where the marginalization of the South, of Southern childhoods, was being overstated. And this kind of, summarizes the kind of discomfort that I felt at many levels. I did not want to talk about marginalized childhoods, but I was also, at the same time, I was also reading works of people like Katrina Ellis, who had a very brilliant piece which came out around 2010-11, Snapshots of a Classroom, where she mined autobiographies in order to talk about, retrieve experiences of those who had grown up in colonial Madras. And I wanted to use interviews as well. And these were some of the works which I thought I could use to simultaneously unpack a very specific regionally ensconced notion of protected childhood in the North, which the idea of the Bildungsmoratorium emerged from, and also empirically talk about a very specific case of protected childhoods in Bengal. So this is where I was coming from. And of of course, now I see a lot of drawbacks in it. If you, since Anandini mentioned the decolonial, the entire decolonial theories enterprise, which comes from Latin American scholarship, you would also see that scholars like Lucia Arabella de Castro, they're also very unhappy with scholars like Imo saying that they would rather play up the commonalities between global southern childhoods and global northern childhoods, because to them this is also, this detracts from the uh, radical potential of the decolonial moment. What one should do is critique and upturn the othering, this entire enterprise of othering southern childhoods in the first place, not efface the differences. So I think in some ways I feel that I'm guilty of what is now being called extroversion. If you look at Sujata Patel's work or Pauline Hauntonji's work, theoretical extroversion, whereby certain, theoretical models are taken and replicated elsewhere. But I also felt there was a need to, I mean, I think I would have done the same all over again, maybe with more theoretical finesse, of also unpacking a northern idea of protected childhood rather than just take the Eurocentric undergirding for granted. So that was where I came from. And now, in terms of work, I think there are two major developments. One is more and more greater engagement with the works of colleagues from history, and the other, which is engagement with a larger community of scholars through the CCYSC, which is the collective that Anandini and another colleague, Divya Kannan, they are conveners of. And I think it helps being part of a larger community where different people are doing different things. So you don't feel that you have to carry the burden of being the voice from the South, which certainly does free up space in a certain way. So one of the things which I'm doing right now, I'm processing it, although I finished the project, is the ICSSR project, where I, like Smruthi, I look at both archival sources as well as do interviews, take the ethnographic, use ethnography as a tool to look at how childhood is enacted on stage in the larger children's theatre scene. But I take three specific cities as well: Pune, Delhi, Calcutta. And the other project, so with the theater project, I am also, it's not like I just look at what children do or how childhood is affected on stage. It also leads me to other questions about what kind of social networks, transcultural social networks, emerged from wanting to develop certain kinds of theater movements for young people in India historically at a certain point of time. So that is one. And the other, which I am currently engaged in, is looking at 1920s, 1930s archival sources of two Anglican missionary societies, and what they reveal about missionary encounters with children. I think in some ways both projects have something of, the childhood studies sensibility in them, in that they try to foreground children, but they're also not entirely mired in these questions. What I'm trying to do in the second one is trying to see what transcultural, transracial encounters look like when seen from a generational lens. So that is where I'm at. It does not very directly address the questions about, the tensions of global or local, of replicating Western theories on Southern soil at the moment. But I guess I'll take that when it comes. And I also feel less obligated to always touch home base and show how I'm sociological or to demonstrate it in my work. So yeah, I think I've spoken for more than 5 minutes here. So Anandini, over to you.
Thanks, Hia. It was fun to hear about your upcoming project as well. We haven't had much of a chance to talk about that yet, but I look forward to it. So, what is our academic and professional journey and how it relates to the sociologies of childhood? As I shared earlier, a lot of my influence between childhood and sociology was influence towards childhood studies was from sociology itself. But then when I went on to do a doctorate in the US, specifically in a department of childhood studies, it was very much, which was very much new at the time. I was trying to push away from the sociological to some extent. But in, the 2007s, the sociology of childhood literature was hot. Everyone had to read it. Even people who were working in the NGO sector in the field 5 to 10 years down the line were spouting, verbatim Prout and James about the paradigms. That's the context in which also a lot of my interests in childhood studies emerged. And, I thought that doing a PhD in discipline radically different from the disciplines in which my own teachers were trained in, right? So I wasn't taught by people with degrees in childhood studies, rather in sociology or literature or philosophy or psychology. So our training was very much, I would say, multidisciplinary, and to create experts in multidisciplinarity as well. So, my research then, I felt, and I do feel, is where these trajectories, really show how they intersect. Like Hia was saying, it's the doing of the work, or the doing of childhood studies in one way that enables us an understanding of what childhood studies is. And so my earlier doctoral research positioned me as someone also who's flipping certain kinds of center periphery dynamics. For instance, I was an Indian conducting an ethnography about young people in America, which also raised larger questions about the racial politics in the country, practices of discrimination, as well as of racial profiling, which I learned through the voices and everyday experiences of working class South Asian American teenagers in Queens, where I did a multi-site ethnography, where I accompanied these young people to sites such as Capitol Hill or other kinds of marches for resistance, or asking for the end of the Racial Profiling Act, retelling stories of horrific hate crimes and speeches by their peers in schools towards them or their friends, helped me make sense of them as very much political subjects, whose class identities, as well as their race and age markers, sort of situated them as young people in contemporary America. And that kind of research was something which, I would talk to some friends about who were from America, but were doing the research in South Asia or in India. And that kind of reversal of research location usually does not raise any eyebrows. We've accepted that there will be some kind of anthropology department that has a language class, will train white students to come and conduct research with very limited, I would say, clear, discussions on ethics that I think are beginning to emerge more and more, even in childhood studies. But I'm digressing here a little bit. But was trying to highlight the point on, positionalities of when we're locating our journeys, they're located also vis-a-vis other kinds of larger questions of power, inequality, global flows. And of course, as a student who was able to go from South Asia to America, which is not an easy process for several students in India, it was possible through certain scholarships and funding that the public university where I went and where Smruthi is now offers for teaching assistants and research assistants. So these institutional mechanisms also have a role to play within the research work in question, larger concepts or frames on how we know what we know, what are the politics of knowledge production, in which we then also have to locate ourselves. But the current research then that I now have trying to wrap up also is a project that is funded from ICSSR, which was done in collaboration with social scientists and architects in my university as well. And as shared in the introduction very kindly, we're trying to examine placemaking processes of migrants who are living in displaced, urban informal settlements in the cities. And we're considering what and how these placemaking processes or networks enable or not their well-being. And this is being conducted into, urban informal settlements in Delhi with migrant children and their families. And why I'm sharing these two research projects in such depth is largely one to make the point that in both these research projects of mine, questions about migration, displacement, identity, place, and political geographies and agency of the young are examined. Right, and these are all tied to specifically questions about children and migrant childhoods. I'm trying to suggest here that questions about young children are as much about everyday socio-political contexts in which they're embedded, but also about the historical, cultural, and social conjunctions at play. So in many ways, I feel like what Michael King, in one of the pieces in Childhood, where he discusses the subfield of sociology of childhood, argues that there are two types of theoretical developments in sociology that have affected the sociology of childhood as well. These are, he says, the sociology of identity and sociology of agency. Of course, here he's relating this to the sociology, particularly in the UK and not in India. But if we were to refer to sociologist of India, Sujata Patel, who he actually introduced me to, because my learnings about sociology of India have happened after I started working. And so I find that the emphasis which some of the key pioneers in the field of sociology of India have focused on, like Greer, has talked about the location of sociology of identity vis-a-vis caste to a very large extent as well. And that has received a fair bit of emphasis in context of sociology of India vis-a-vis childhood. There has been very little. And so, as we think about how, this trajectory is, where it's leading me now, perhaps, it's taking me to larger questions of the interconnection of the social and the child by thinking about how we locate children in societies at large. I'm working with some colleagues on this idea of a child-responsive democracy. What does that look like? Do we have any kind of decolonial models of democracy that are distinct from Western democracies? What these might be? As I started teaching at EUD, I also became very intentful or committed to reading Ambedkar as well. And I've tried to, in a recent piece of mine, unpacked his ideas on democracy, on who is a minority, and idea of adult universal suffrage to relate it with children's context for an edited book on children's suffrage rights. So I'm really excited about that work and where this engagement of the society with the child, what with childhood, where that's leading me in terms of larger epistemic questions about the fields. Do we have to think of a post-colonial turn or a decolonial turn in childhood studies, what that might look like, and how do we then engage with debates around North-South divide, what Bala and several others also have argued about, this unequal dynamic between the North and South, because the theoretical North is separated from the empirical South in many ways, which is why, white PhD students will come to the South to do their empirical research and then connect it to theoretical concepts largely emerging from the West. So, a big push in terms of indigenizing methodologies. Bagil Chalisa has written a fantastic book on that. Would also be fruitful ways through which we can, make these connections between sociologies of societies and sociology of childhood or childhood studies. And, I know we'll talk about boundaries later, so I'll stop here for now and leave the floor for Smruthi.
Thank you so much, Anandini. And Anandini, here you've brought up many of the concerns and questions that have also influenced my journey. I just want to start with the question of and address the issue of institutional mechanisms and funding that has been central to my academic journey as well. And sort of present this as a concern and question that has made me think, which is that I had access to, but also chose to apply to a university in the United States when I was looking to conduct research in Tamil Nadu. And how my understanding of global flows that influenced young people's lives in India influenced this move. I think has been critical to my conceptualizing the interdisciplinary project that I'm working on. And speaking of conceptualizations, within my training initial training within the sociology of childhood in childhood studies, in the childhood studies department, a lot of the dominant debates that we were presented with and we were thinking with in our training were engaged with centering the agency and voice of children. And that's something Hia discussed earlier. You felt like you should demonstrate how your project centered the agency and the voice of young people in communities, and young people's agency and voice as something that has been denied in the past. And what has been particularly interesting and helpful for me is the work of scholars who have helped to constantly challenge this distinction of agency and individual voice that arises from like this theoretical north and empirical south binary as well. For instance, the idea of non-sovereign relationalities, which Bala discusses, building on Spivak's work, where Bala speaks back to a right-centric discourse that is right-centric and participation-centric discourse, which is tied to agency and voice, which is also a focus of young people's rights that's embedded within the UNCRC. I think I come to the field and my project in my academic journey at sort of a theoretically opportune moment, which I'm grateful for, which is that I get to work with scholars who are already challenging this theoretical north and empirical south kind of logic. And being part of CCYSC and other communities which do this, or has a lot of scholars who do this, has been particularly enriching to my academic journey as well. And this includes acquaintance with the work of Hia and Anandini through this community. And I just want to go back to Hia's mentioning how while working on an Erasmus Mundus scholarship, you felt like you had to commit to certain theoretical and empirical work that responds to this funding as responsibility. And that again embeds us as scholars in some ways within the very theoretical frameworks that we're discussing. So yeah, just wanted to also speak about that, and being taught by teachers who were themselves trained in different disciplines is another thing Anandini brought up, and colleagues who are trained and are bringing together different disciplines has been central to my current research, which looks at adolescent students' lived experiences of cleanliness discourses in schools in the context of Tamil Nadu in India. Thanks, Rituparna, for introducing me through mentioning this project. In this work, I explore how young people negotiate with institutional rules, infrastructures, and lessons on cleanliness, and not just as individuals with agency. Their opinions and actions are situated in their relationships of care with their kin and friends and their environment, simultaneously also in the historical, economic politics of their context. They are both cared for and they perform care work through and in the realm of these relationships and structures. So current theoretical debates around non-sovereign relationalities and care work has also, from a sociology point of view, helped me open kinship from being parochialized or specified within a context or a province. So so this work extends and echoes scholars who've centered on how biopolitics works in and through affect, kinship, and intergenerational exchange of knowledge. And institutions such as state and the school also learn from communities they work with within these global flows of intervention and epistemologies of childhood. So going forward, I'm thinking, I'm broadly interested in researching and learning about young people's diverse and intergenerational negotiations between public health and environmental sustainability in their everyday lives. And this is also from a point of interest in thinking with young people's role in public health, where they are not just perceived as sites of intervention and change, but as complex negotiators who deal with not just infrastructural and social lack, but also the complexities of the many dimensions that they work with. I hope I didn't cross too much time.
No, thank you so much, Smruthi. So the next question is kind of related, and we would want to know about the disciplinary boundaries of the sociology of childhood per se, and what kind of impetus informs the field.
Shall I, Rituparna?
Yes, yes, please. Yeah.
Thank you. So I don't think the first part of the question about the disciplinary boundaries of the sociology of childhood is something I can answer with much certainty. And also because areas of work have expanded, and also modes of doing sociology as we knew it has changed, I think, radically in the last 8 years or so. But to very quickly kind of talk about the question of impetus, from the 1980s, you see the key impetus, as you know, Anandini and Shruti also sort of kind of mentioned when they were speaking, is the issue of children's rights. It is, of course, the UNCRC, of course, triggers. I mean, at first one central debate and then many spin-offs from it. And this is something I can talk about in greater detail maybe for the next question. But I was also trying to look up some of the basic journals where sociological research from India is published. So Contributions, Economic Political Weekly, Sociological Bulletin. And you would see that an EPW, of course, this is not an article, but a book review, appears as early as 1980. It's a review of a book which has been written by Shumanta Banerjee. I could not locate the book, so I'm assuming it is the historian Shumanta Banerjee. And it's a monograph on child labor, and it is funded by and published by the Canadian Anti-Slavery Association. Where Banerjee, apparently, at least from the review, it seems he's not taking a moral standpoint against child labor, but sort of using something like ethnography and also a bit of history to unpack the contexts in which children labor. And of course, from the late 80s onwards, you see a lot of, I mean, there's a babel of voices around the question of children's rights. And I know most of us sometimes we connected when we thought about, especially Anandini and I at one point, I think we had this conversation about how the maximum corpus of research we encountered at one point from India came from NGOs. You know, and this is something I also worked on for my MPhil dissertation when I was in JNU, that you had various kinds of NGOs, you had a lot of UN-funded agencies which were producing research around children's rights, and these were using tools which were like ethnography-like tools to talk about the context in which children labored. So this was one. So I thought it was typical of the Southern context, this context of intervention through policies and so on and so forth. But like I said, in 2009, the year I went to Germany, If I remember correctly, Andreas Lange from the Deutsche Jugend Institute, the German Youth Institute, he hosted, maybe it was the first, I don't know. The German Sociological Association now has a Sociology of Childhood wing, Kindheit Soziologie, it's called. And I don't know really, but I think it was one of the first or earliest conferences on sociology of childhood that they hosted in Germany from the Sociological Association. And I still have the PowerPoint presentations that were sent to us. And I think out of 14 or 13 presenters, excepting one, everybody else was presenting on, NGOs, and NGOs located in Norway, NGOs located in Germany. So Child Watch, Eurochild, or they were talking about something called the ECS, the European ESM, European social model. And I think the debate, as much as I understood then, was about the EU's larger policy reforms or suggested policy reforms about child protection and child rights, and what that meant in terms of the individual national level policies and national understandings of family and a child's place and degrees of negotiation between the different generations within a family and so on. It was revelatory to me in retrospect. At that point, I don't think I appreciated that moment at all. But now, when I look back, I think, and this also says something about the German macro sociological perspective, which was pretty robust back then. And this was the way one made sense of sociology of childhood. 4 years down the line, or 3 years down the line, the same sociological congress, I think mostly under the initiative of Florian Esser, they organized another conference, and this time it was completely different. You saw very little of this macro sociological tenor. The conference was called Reconceptualizing Agency. And although the majority of speakers were German, there were a couple of non German participants as well. I think from the global south, maybe I was the only one. And most of the question was about the anxiety around how Eurocentric and how white the category of agency might come across as. So there was a huge shift which happened within the field of sociology of childhood in a span of 2, 3, or 4 years. And what I think now has happened now is what Anandini rightly calls it. This is a decolonial moment. This is another impetus. It is an impetus of a different kind. The in-between phase state years, I think 2008 to 2016, 17, was when the rights discourse did not die out completely, but rather one looked at different sides of children's agency and children's negotiation. So I mean, this whole Natasha Klocker's work and this whole debate about thin agency, thick agency is also about looking at children from marginalized pockets in the South and seeing how much of, how agency can be reconceptualized, but also uncovering what children do. The impetus now is of a different kind. It is theoretically theoretically motivated to come out of the haze of predominantly Eurocentric notions, which have come to take the place of universal notions. But there also, I think there are a lot of, it's a fragmented area. I don't know exactly how to articulate this, but since Anandini was also mentioning Sujata Patel, Sruti's work, I think, would the article which has come out in Children's Geography, it would also probably reflect some of these different tensions which make up the moment of sociology of childhood now. You have this voice speaking out for making a case for indigenous sociology for a long time now, and this happens regardless of the sociology of childhood. If you look at any of the books that T.K. Omen and Satish Tabarwal or Sujata Patel or Moiti Chaudhuri at different points, they've taken stock of the field and the state of the field, you will see this concern, this need to talk about developing our own theories. And at the same time, there are also inbuilt checks and balances. Sujata Patel, for example, when she's in one of her latest works in Current Sociology, 2020, I think, she says that she talks about how there's a danger that indigenous theories might also be give foil to very specific culturalist assumptions which emanate from particular communities. And there's also this other problem. I mean, the way she talks about how the colonial episteme ordered knowledge production, that all things material, all things economic and political, for these our models were Europe. But for all things on the spiritual and cultural plane, one resorted to a certain kind of majoritarian, religious perspective, right? And I hope I'm not confusing people, but some years ago I heard this and I was both troubled and amused at the same time. I think it was a criticism directed towards me, and someone said that one cannot claim to work on childhood or do sociology of childhood and be from Bengal and not resort to Tagore. I didn't know what to make of this comment at first, and I've kind of beaten up myself quite a bit about this, wondering where could I have brought in Tagore, and but this is exactly how there is a danger. I'm not saying this essentially always is the case, but there's always a danger of this uh, call for indigenous theorizations, because first of all, if you're challenging the Eurocentric notion of doing science, doing theory, which I completely understand, and then you think as alterity, you're offering something like this, very indigenous communities, faith-based communities, or language-based, ethnicity-based communities understanding of something, if that passes as theory, how is work to be done? I mean, what would research from that light look like is also something I worry about. So yeah, I think I answered the question, at least from my point of view, what the principal impetuses are which form the field. And I think I said a little bit more and confused everyone in the back end, so I'll just stop now and move over to Anandini and Smruthi. Go on, you two.
Thanks, yeah. You're definitely not confusing anything at all. Of course, I hear some snippets from some of our interactions as well, and really sort of goes to show how these boundaries are made and shaped, not just in curricula, not just in sort of programs, but in these more interactive spaces of conferences, of meetings, of seminars, being part of associations. So, I mean, I'm just sort of beginning with something I had not thought I would say, but hearing Hia makes me think of this point about where these boundaries are made, where they're getting crafted, who is crafting them, who is considered as allowed to craft it also, right? That you have that baggage with you of, I mean, it is, I think, a great privilege also that the three of us here today have had academic training outside of India, and it comes with a certain kind of acceptance in spaces, makes you more competitive, given how many frameworks in India still continue to work, where reading a degree from abroad versus a degree from India does get compared in certain ways, in my experience. But, not to drift off entirely to the tangent of where and how these boundaries are made, I think sticking to maybe just focusing on, I'm bifurcating sociology of childhood into that which exists in the West and that which may exist or exist, like we can question how it exists, if at all, in context of South Asia or India. And there are several works, like Barry Mayall, Madeleine Leonard, and several others, Heather Montgomery, who have written sort of textbooks on sociology of childhood now, right? So if you Google search sociology of childhood, you'll get a lot of material. Like, this is a field that exists. What is this on and on about how it doesn't exist, or we're still debating how it's still in a nascent field or has established or come of age theoretically in a certain space, as Smruthi was saying. But a lot exists around sociology of childhood in writing that documents Western sociology, Western childhoods. To say the least, there will be some episodes or moments from other parts of the world, whether it's in the form of that sixth culture study by Beatrice Whiting long ago, which Hia mentioned, or it could be in other kinds of, anthropology of childhood textbooks that sociology students would also read, that look at, culture in a certain way and draw on instances of work and marriage amongst some tribal communities, maybe in some locations in the South. So that's the extent of sociology of childhood that you would get in those textbooks. But when we think of it in context of India, I mean, quite frankly, it does not exist, I would say. However, maybe, it exists in its interdisciplinarity, right? And the fact that we're currently having this conversation also shows that there is an interest in it, and it exists perhaps in certain kinds of, gaps and spaces of liminality, or other kinds of forums, where I see it in CCYSC, in our blogs, our feature essays, the podcasts we host. There are various forms of this sociology of childhood, in a sense, that exists in India. Yeah. And however, I think because there is a lack of it existing institutionally, that is the absence of academic programs. And I know I'm jumping into the next question already, and I won't say much then at all for that question, because I think they're interrelated. Because to see the boundaries, I'm also questioning, how is this in context of India already? Because I don't think I want to spend time discussing sociology of childhood as it exists in the West. There's plenty on it already. I don't want to take up my time for that. So institutionally in India, we see there's an absence of childhood studies programs or curricula, but it does exist in forms of electives. For instance, there's a elective I teach in my MA education program called Global Childhoods. I know Divya teaches a course on the history of childhoods. And several other colleagues, perhaps here you bring it in different ways. And so, colleagues who are researching in this area are also making incursions in their curriculum, if the school or the space allows for it. So we do have to, in some ways, as what Spiros mentions in his editorial in 2018, that, the agenda of childhood needs to, I quote, establish the limits of what we have inherited from the past, so that new and potentially more productive ways of knowledge production may come into being. So why I'm saying this is because I think if sociology of childhood or childhood studies does not fully exist yet, or is still emerging in India, then we also have to question what is it that we take from the Western sociology of childhood, and what is it that we have to alter and reconsider, given the questions of caste, given the questions of varied marginalities that exist for children in relation to the societies in which they live. And hence, childhood studies, the boundaries, I feel, of sociology of childhood or childhood studies have to be relatively fluid. If we go back to thinking about some of our pioneers in the field of sociology, such as Radha Kamal Mukherjee, for instance, or even if we refer to Sujata Patel, they both offer understandings of sociology as interdisciplinary and cross-cutting boundaries, and that they cross boundaries, they are crossing boundaries. And Radha Kamal Mukherjee, pretty early on in the, 19th century, already criticizing the compartmentalization in social sciences. In his writings, he combined economics, sociology, and history. So history and sociology, as we see them as so separate, were not, in his mind, very separate disciplinary compartments that need to be created. He was constantly searching instead for linkages or common grounds between the social sciences. Sujata Patel more recently points out the interdisciplinary turn of sociology itself. She's writing particularly at a time when women's studies was getting established, and she was, questioning this kind of need for re-examination within sociology of, the subject positionalities that we take. She was truly observing a turn within sociology around, one that was away from what earlier Indian sociology was about, which she says is methodological nationalism and colonial modernity. And this tussle, she says, that some sociologists were constantly engaged in this sort of tradition versus modernity debates. It's extremely dry here for some reason for me. It's making my throat a little itchy. Sorry. So, so Sujata Patel, asks, sees this shift in sociology as also turning towards new kinds of questions, looking at new subject positions, and being interdisciplinary in nature in some ways. And so within social sciences, though, while these two sociologists point towards this sort of shift within the field and becoming less, less boundary averse, so to say, we have others like Gopal Guru who actually point out that social sciences in India are very, very divisive, if not in terms of the disciplinary boundaries, but definitely in terms of the location of caste vis-a-vis social sciences. So he actually argues that there's a divide in the social sciences where there are the theoretical Brahmins and the empirical Shudras. There's a much lengthier unpacking of this comment by him in his piece called How Egalitarian Are the Social Sciences, that's been published in an edited book and also in EPW. And so, if we want to see some kind of sociology of childhood in India, there's social movements, there's sociology of, where I bring in sociology of childhood slyly is through an elective on culture, identity, society, where you cannot not talk about youth culture. It's important to question identities of age as well in such courses. And also to then look at what are the divisions, the divisivenesses in a sense that exist in the field of sociology in India, and try and turn towards a sociology of childhood, which accommodates for, or is at least aware of these larger gaps or challenges, and try in some ways address them from the start, from the get-go, instead of waiting for other kinds of turns to emerge. So I won't touch upon other very interesting related thoughts that I was having when Hia was speaking on children's rights, on NGOs and indigeneity, but maybe that can come up later if we have time in the later half of the discussion. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Anandini. You've given me a lot of different aspects to think about. I also want to respond to Zuza Millet's comment with a question. And just quickly, when we talk about the impetus of a field, whose impetus are we talking about? It's a concern that came up to me when I was thinking with you. So, I mean, we, including us, are people who identify with the field of sociology of childhood, and research, doctoral research, and like work within academia as a specific kind of example of what we're talking about, structure and agency in this case, right? Like we have training, and there is a lot of fluidity around research that is influenced by the structures that we work with. So as a graduate student, I engage in curatorial work of assembling literature that speaks to my topic of analysis. And that curatorial work is simultaneously what has already been written, but also what I'm looking for. especially in the modes of searching that online libraries and routes have provided us with at this point, and we explore actively. The question again now is whom do we teach, or whose work, or what kind of work and theoretical perspectives do we teach as the sociology of childhood, and who are we required to cite and incorporate into analysis, and within this citational politics, what kinds of, even what kinds of work turns up when we look up a word on Google or a search engine. All these things seem to shape how the impetus of the field itself is informed in some direction, and sort of informing also the fashions of the field at any given point of time. I'm just using the term fashions to speak of the temporal nature of the impetus as well. So speaking to Zuzamile's question, when I was looking at uniforms and theorizing uniforms as an everyday cultural artifact, these socialist histories of the education and welfare provision in India was critically linked to the kind of spaces and theorizings that you mentioned in your question around how Eastern Europe is connected to Asia and Africa through certain histories that don't get actively addressed in when we think about the global north, global south divide very clearly. So I think the question of how and why we curate certain citational routes is something that probably we should also think about when we think about the impetus of a field.
Right. The next question to all three of you is, what is sociology or sociologies of childhood vis-a-vis India, and where do you see it? And if not, why? So we'll begin with you again, Dr. Sen, if you could answer that.
Dipali, thank you. I'll try and keep it very short because I see we are sort of running out of time. Well, I think Smruthi gives me something to sort of start with. I have been, for many reasons, interested in this curatorial work. Also, I think to give myself a sense of myself and my work, a sense of legitimacy, and to find out who I can speak to, literally or otherwise, within the discipline. And this is something I've been doing consciously, I think, for quite a while now. So needless to say, something we have already established in the beginning, that the main post-independent sociological categories here in India were family and kinship, caste, religion, largely, and then later class and gender sort of became categories one started playing with to a certain extent. But we have also established that there is no institutionalized sociology of childhood as such in the Indian context. But that being said, there are several things to remember. One is that if you look at M.S.A. Rao has this piece where he called Sociology in the 1980s, where he's reviewing the kind of work done in the 70s and 80s. And he says that in the 70s, sociology of demography is dying out. And I find this instructive because prior to the 80s, you do see a lot of work, sometimes even Veena Mazumdar's work. One is, I think, edited by Veena Mazumdar. You have IAS officers alongside sociologists who are working on sex differential, juvenile sex differentials, and so on and so forth. Of course, this did not have the sensibilities of the 90s and, children's agency and so on and so forth, but you did identify children there. More startlingly, if you look at M.N. Srinivas's Remembered Village, which predates the 1980s in that sense, you will see children are ensconced within the framework of the village of Rampura, and two children who have a name and a role are the headman Ramegowda's two daughters, Aki and Laki. So I just very quickly want to sort of read this out. So this one child, Lucky, she's 11 years old in 1948 when Srinivas is doing fieldwork, and he says it was common for men to come and take, men to kind of start speculating about the nature of affinal ties with the village headman's daughter. So Okalaga youth from the neighboring villages would often come and take a look at Lucky to see if they could book her for marriage. Um, so Srinivas says Ramegowda used to tease his daughter, of whom he was extremely fond, about the visitors. Lucky used to, or pretended to be used to, annoyed, and gestured eloquently with her face and hands to express her dislike of the very idea and of her father. Ramegowda was, however, scared of his daughters bursting into tears, and he took care to stop teasing well before he reached that point. Uh, of course, the larger work there's not sustained interest in children, but children are one of the many characters which come in, and they're not typecast in that sense. They're also doing, and these are also sites of negotiation, even if we have like a fleeting glimpse of it. The other thing which I wanted to say is, again, going back to M.S.A. Rao's work, of course, you have Leela Dubey and some of the other sociologists who kind of, played a seminal role in bringing this category of gender to the forefront. They had been also talking about gender socialization. I'm not sure exactly in which decade, but possibly 80s. And then Rao says that in 1979, the All Kerala Sociological Society was the first to choose the theme of child and society for its seventh conference. And he says that given the kind of reception it had and the number of participants, although he does not disclose what these are, he thinks that sociology of child development was soon going to be the new burgeoning area of like subfield within sociology in India. Right. So you do find it studied here and there. There's also Urvashi Misri's work. In contributions, if you just type childhood, you will see this work appeared in 1985, and she's a student of Veena Das and T.N. Madan. And this is part of a PhD work submitted at Delhi School of Economics, where she's using indigenous theory of Kashmiri Pandit kinship to talk about the idea of the child and the child's personhood, using categories of divinity, using categories like Petri clan, Sapinda, Gotra, and so on. So you do find these scattered in instances, although of course this is not a self-conscious sociology of childhood approach in that sense. I do think very quickly, and I can sort of expand on this much later when there are questions, there's something else at work here as to why we don't see more work on sociology of childhood. So I have a course which I've been teaching, a postgrad course on sociology of childhood from 2013, and I can see many students, many former students from that course here as well. And some of them have gone on to work on something related to childhood, but not childhood per se. There has always been this, I don't know if things has changed for students now, there has always been the burden of finding a theoretical fit for one's work. And this haunts, I don't know, because I was only trained in India that way. I think my training in Germany doesn't really count because it was not handsy training in that sense. But this haunted us as researchers who were trained here to a great extent. And I think this is my difference with Anandini and Smruthi in that sense. And I don't think we were the only ones. If you look at Professor Mati Chaudhary's The Practice of Sociology and many of her earlier and later works, there has always been this concern. There has about, where sociology of gender figures. There has been Sharmila Rege's concern about an imminent ghettoization of women's studies. Then even further back, you have Satish Savarwal, who's not sure where he fits, being an Indian who has worked on the Embu in Kenya, not sure how to place historical sociology because he's institutionally located in the CHS and JNU. And that apart, it feels really good to see all this work in retrospect. If you look at figures like Parthanath Mukherjee, who were once stalwarts in the discipline, although these were not people we read as students, Parthanath Mukherjee at one point says that social change was a theoretical framework which was cresting in India. And he wanted to work on the Gramdan Bhudan movement, but he did not know how to fit that into the framework of social change. And the alternative was functionalist theory. And much later, Satish Sabharwal in Uncertain Transplants, he has a piece where he says, having the privilege of being trained in an anthropology department, I'm paraphrasing here, meant I could do much more than colleagues who were trained in American sociology or who took a Marxist view of society. And he believes that both these cases, if you were a sociology student in America, or if you took a Marxist view of things here, it meant that your theoretical trajectory was already charted out and there was so much you could do. And that was not the case with Satish Sabharwal, who, as we know, his trajectory is very checkered in terms of what he does. So this has always been this burden, and to a great extent, one wouldn't accuse anyone, but childhood studies also developed its ideas were disseminated in a very lopsided manner. Even if there was work on this global south, one was not sure how the categories we were familiar with, and these are not categories to throw away, kinship, family, caste, none of these are categories to throw away or belittle, but we didn't know how to attempt a reconciliation between this armory of categories and that armory of categories. And as much as scholars like Patel would feel that extroversion is a problem, but a lot of students, maybe now they don't, but a lot of us also, we started out like that. If you look at someone like Sabharwal also starts out with always doing a comparison, Punjab and somewhere in Europe. And I think one learns the limits of stretching a theoretical framework and so on and so forth. I would not take, look down upon attempts to not replicate, but attempts to kind of follow someone whose work speaks to you. So on to my other two colleagues. We are really running short of time here. So sorry.
No, that's fine. I said most of what I wanted to in the earlier question itself. And I'm just really happy to hear Hia's collage of pieces here and there of childhood, sociology of childhood in India. Deepak Behera's work was one I remember we had talked of as, it was the work. You had to cite it if you were writing a proposal for any work on childhood in India. So they exist, but they're in these pockets, in these different disciplines. And as a disciplined boundary of sociology of childhood per se, or if we talk about sociologies of childhood in India, we find it very difficult to excavate these. There's no one combined space for it. It's emerging. I remember when we met in Jadavpur University, there was a conference on childhoods and intersectionalities and multiple childhoods funded by CSSR. There were people from children's rights sector, from academia, I from Delhi, Hia was there, and some other colleagues. And we came away with this. Yeah.
Sorry, Rusa. Rusa was the funder, I think. Sorry,
okay.
Go on.
Oh, okay, I see. Sorry if I got the name of the funder wrong. And we were left wanting of a space where we can conceptually get together or, support the work of NGOs rather than, where they're trying to fit, like what Hia said, their work with one theoretical model, instead for us to work together to perhaps bring forward their own conceptualizations of what is going on in the everyday of children, and offering new ways of reading that maybe. But I'll stop here. I don't want to talk too much here. As I think I said, I had a long response earlier. Smruthi, for you.
Thanks, Anandini. Very briefly, I also want to highlight the entanglement between childhood studies of childhood and studies in education, where the emphasis on providing equitable and just and welfare-oriented ways of looking at institutions center some of the academic impetuses around sociologies of childhood vis-a-vis India as well. And I've been thrilled to encounter researchers in a variety of different fields, actually: geography, sociology, education, design, publishing, over the years who have complicated the centering of socialization of children as the way to look at young people, or this singular and universal way to look at young people. I see scholars and practitioners work on sociological perspectives of childhood using methods and seeking outcomes that are specific to their domain of work. However, the concern with the sociological dimensions of children's lives in childhood, I kind of see it nested in so many different fields as I look at the landscape of many flows that enter young people's lives and discuss children and childhood in India. Yeah, just very briefly.
Yeah, so if we could also talk a little bit about the publishing spaces, literature, journals that sociologies of childhood in or of India occupy, and about their timelines. How do we read absences, marginalia, and remarks? If we could begin with you here.
Rituparna, thank you. I think I'll sort of hand it over to Smruthi and Anandini, because in a sense, I think I answered some of these questions in my previous responses. So I'll take less time and yeah.
Smruthi, why don't you go ahead if you like?
Or Smruthi, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I can. I'm echoing Hia Sen and Anandini's observations in much of this. So I'm going to reflect on my literature review process for my dissertation, where I have come to encounter scholarship in sociological perspectives, as I mentioned earlier, not just in journals that identify with childhood as one of their topical central concerns. So those focusing on area studies such as South Asian studies, with scholars working simultaneously both in and outside of India with institutional affiliations, multidisciplinary journals with geographic concerns, history of society across different dimensions, journals in the field of education and gender studies. These have been particularly helpful. And I think finding literature across such a broad publishing landscape is often not straightforward. So scholars' meticulous citation practices across disciplines has been particularly helpful and has guided the direction of searches. I have also been grateful again for the many new and upcoming platforms and communities that I mentioned earlier that bring together scholars and practitioners on thematic areas of research, like Anandini was mentioning earlier, that are not necessarily classroom spaces or institutional spaces, but are fluid interactions between these. Just like the field, I think just like young people's lives, the fluidities between institutions and scholars working on these topics kind of reflect that complexity. So both in the archives and in publishing in sociology and history, I continue to encounter a lot of subtexts, trails of children and childhood, and marginalia, or discussion that is not central to the theme of the book, but has a critical presence. And that's something I think Hia underscored quite a bit earlier. So this has been particularly important in researching specific regional histories and sociopolitics without losing sight of larger thematic concerns within sociology of childhood. So within Tamil Nadu, for instance, education and young people's lives has historically been a site of cultural reform and political contestation against caste violence in the state. So when I read about, say, politicians, movements, institutions, I also encounter how young people's lives are implicated and entangled with these. And I think that's something Catriona, who's joined us today in the audience, also underscores in her work. So this also, I think, I want to share the question with Hia and Anandini and the audience. So how do we think about the epistemological separation between children and adults that may have a much more complex and complicated life in the concrete ontological dimensions that we encounter and engage with? And how do we think about that when we think about publishing, for instance, and academic spaces?
Thank you, Smruthi. Our last question before we take up some audience questions to the three of you is, what ways of thinking about childhood?
Sorry, Dipali. I'll just quickly add to this
Sure, please.
question. I think it was really interesting, Smruthi, to hear about your process of your literature review, which is actually quite a fascinating study of its own, I think, to see where different research came from for you. Similarly, I think more recent pieces, such as Irene Grace Sandal's piece in Childhood, also talks about sort of what are the publishing spaces for childhood studies, literature and research, opens the question of sort of, citation politics, who gets published, who gets cited, where the canon of the field itself is sort of reproducing some of the same names and works. And it shows that, there are absences of reading lists that can also cut across contexts. When we look at research published in journals, do we look at journals that are focused on childhood or those that are focused on other thematics that then write about childhood? So the question I think I can pose is, how much are other disciplines also engaging with childhood studies, and in what spaces do we see that? Where do they circulate? Does it exist in spaces like third world thematics or South Asia journals? And what does this mean in terms of new established limits of the field then? Of course, this is a temporal question, definitely, no doubt about it. What are the larger ways in which we can now reimagine the field will help shift, where journals circulate, how one accesses people in the third world or global south. Even with university affiliations, sometimes we can struggle to access books that have recently been published in the field. We rely on, what was recently in hot debate of LibGen and other kinds of websites that help you get journal articles. Otherwise, you'd have to pay for or request the university to get for you. So there are lots of absences, margin lias, that exist in the field. How do we, what and how do we read them? I think the frame of reading perhaps requires, there's something that Tata Kabebe, Ida, Marie, and myself are working on an introduction to a special issue for the journal Childhood, and realized in the process of, collating these papers that there is also something maybe that one has to adopt when these North-South encounters happen, a position of epistemic humility, one that, takes into account the challenges with which scholars from the global south are working on a day-to-day basis and yet producing or trying to produce research. There aren't very many, alternatives to teaching in terms of, getting time off for research. Those kinds of, things are absent. Even institutions like the Council for Social Science Research tells you very clearly that, getting a project does not mean you can get a course release. You are doing research, which is honorary work. I was told this. So we have to figure out the time for it has to come out from our holidays, from our family time. And these are the conditions under which scholars are working in Global South. And this is with university affiliations. Those who are working in the field or in project mode are constantly burdened with a lot of challenges of the field. So, can we adopt some kind of epistemic humility that then accounts for and then creates structural ways through which there can be support for those in the Global South, in publishing spaces, in creating the corpus and journals of these places? Who are the series editors? Who are the editors of journals? Are they just tokenistic, representations like what Hia mentioned in the piece where Irene Rizzini reflects on her role as an editor of Childhood? So we need to perhaps then turn towards, reading these marginal years through a framework of epistemic pluralism, one that accounts for multiple ways of knowing and of knowledge production, and begin to read what these may be before we start trying to create comparative registers or other kinds of markings or readings of the marginal. So I'll stop there for this question and leave the rest for perhaps our end Q&A even. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's a good time for Dipali, if you don't mind, maybe it's a good space to open up for audience questions because we have colleagues and students here. And I think we have said more or less what needs to be said.
Right. So yes, we can take some audience questions now. So to the audience, if you have any questions, you can just raise your hand maybe and we can let you in, or you can put down your questions in the chat box.
Katrina, does she have a question? Okay.
Chandni Basu has raised her hand.
I have a question for Katrina for later then.
Yeah, go ahead with Katrina's question. Thank you.
Thanks, Chandni. Katrina, very quick question. Are you there? Can you hear me? Thanks. So I was wondering this, especially because of this onslaught of critique about scholars from the North studying the global South. I was wondering, it would be good to have you sort of reflect on, does that make you self-conscious? Does that change how you, does that inform how you do research when you're writing about colonial Madras? Especially at this time in the last 3 or 4 years when ever since this Southern theory, Southern point of view has been cresting to a different new level. Could you tell us quickly about this?
Thanks, Hia, for asking the question. Thanks, Katrina, for taking it up.
Okay, this is off the top of my head. Isn't very thoughtful. I don't think childhood studies is, because I'm a historian, not a sociologist, so I'll take it as a historian's point of view. And I don't think history of childhood is established in the global North as much as you think it maybe is. So there's no disciplinary boundaries for historians of childhood, and they find that difficult to negotiate. Anyway, I suspect that's comparable in the South. Majority world. I think what's interesting is the unpicking of the notion of childhood and universalism. That's what I find quite interesting. And this idea that universal childhoods can't be linked to the glory. I think that's been going on for a long time in the North. Maybe we're listening more. Maybe we're being more humble in how we approach. I think there's a problem that if you're working in the global South, you need to read all the literature in the North and then formulate your own views. And I don't think that has shifted yet. As working on Chennai, I feel like we need to provincialize the north of India. And maybe you spoke to that in some of your, how do you theorize indigenous? So the Bailey provincializing Bengal is, I think, quite interesting in these terms as well, that we can still have caste still becomes quite important. So I think there are lots of different layers to unpick. And I think in the global North, we're aware, most of us are aware of that and trying to listen. I'm not sure that really answers what you're saying though.
No, it does in some part.
I'm here to learn. Sorry.
Thank you, Katrina. Chandni?
Yeah. So first of all, I would like to congratulate you. It was a very good panel. So it's great to see all of you as well. Anandini Dar after a long time, Smruthi for the first time. So a lot of questions coming to mind, but I'll just constrain to one question, which is about the NGO sector. You know, both of you spoke about the NGO sector. So I'm interested in the question of transdisciplinarity right now. So would you like to speak a little bit on that? Thank you.
Anandini, is this something, I think you're better equipped to answer this than me. So would you?
I'll try. Thanks, Hia. If I understand the question correctly, Chandni, and I don't know if I found a question in it, but you're asking us to speak to the question of transdisciplinarity and maybe a little bit more about our reflections of the NGO sector and its role in childhood studies. I'm
Yes,
taking
that's
this question
right.
this way. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. And then how can we work together with the NGO sector?
Okay. Right. So the reason why maybe this is a question I can try and address is because of having worked briefly with the development sector. Even after my PhD, I did a few projects with CARE International on looking at girls' safety and security within schools and teachers' manual for it for children in UP. I think much like the emergence of childhood studies within the UK frame coming from the children's rights movement, scholars have also pointed out that the turn towards childhood studies more aggressively, even in India, can be seen through the turn towards children's rights and how NGOs working with children's welfare are closely connected to questions around their protection rights, their participation rights. How they play out, of course, are different, but they seem to know the language of rights. And through that liberal language, they're also, unfortunately, at times, reproducing the deficit logic of childhoods in the South by functioning as, even within the subaltern, many post-colonial theorists have also tended to ask us to look at the periphery and the marginal and to look at how reproduced identities of the colonial can be possible within modern constructions of childhood as well. There might be tokenistic forms of participation in NGOs. In the name of rights, certain practices may be set on paper but not happening on the ground. We see that lots of my students, they conduct their MA dissertations on topics related to rights, and oftentimes either engage with teachers or engage with people such as in DCPCR, the Delhi Commission for the Protection of the Rights of the Child, and try and ask those who develop these programs in NGOs, what is their understanding of children and childhood? How do they perceive young people? And then how do they try and implement this in their programs and their everyday functioning in the work? We tend to see this disconnect between what they tell us of how they think about children and childhood and how it plays out in the programs. So they might know the literature that children have rights, they have voices, they have agency, but we don't see the demonstration of agency in how the juvenile home schedule is planned, what the children are supposed to be doing from day to day, whether the counselor is coming there and actually listening to these children, or is somehow reproducing a reminder of inequality within neoliberal frameworks and putting blame on children, or something like that I witnessed at one point when I was working with juvenile homes for boys. So working together with the NGOs, I think in context of India, and others might have said this before me, cannot be completely divorced from the field of childhood studies. The public work of childhood studies relates to fighting for equal positions for children in society. If we think of some of the principles of a democracy, the one that Ambedkar proposes is one not just of political liberty, right? To have political liberty truly would mean having social and economic equality in societies. And children clearly are still socially and economically quite marginal in our societies. So I'm making this very broad leap here to say that NGOs have to do that work of creating equal spaces for children. And academics who are working in childhood studies, or at least in the sociology of childhood, also have a responsibility towards the activism for equal worlds for children. Similarly, we saw this kind of movement in the women's rights um, segment, when women's studies was coming up. Scholars have, feminists working in the field, Susi Tharu particularly points out that it was the feminist movement that made women's studies possible. But then at one point, the women's studies had to take the lead for the feminist movement, right? So ideas and concepts that were emerging from the discipline began to inform the field as well. So there's a symbiotic relationship between the, I think, NGO sector and the field of childhood studies, where I'm not suggesting that the NGO sector is the only space where learning, something has to be taught to them. Working with them means we somehow as academics will bring some kind of knowledge from the ivory tower and place it upon them, but it's also about learning from the field. We've come out of that in some ways, and trying to make sense of perhaps childhood studies is more, what Chandni's offered this term of transdisciplinary. Is there going to be some kind of eclectic transdisciplinarity that can then be possible in Indian childhood studies, where the field, the theory, the praxis all comes together in some ways? And I think that's something that even with CCYSC, just to conclude, and I see Hia has her hand up, I do want to share that it's been an active choice to kind of push the boundaries of institutionalization as much as we can, so that we can also include children in that process. We don't know to what extent we'll continue to do that, but to bring in children's voices, even if it's just representationally or tokenistically, or in some ways trying to bring it in their experiences in different formats, is something that is necessary for childhood studies in India. I think it cannot be separated from the field, because the reality of all our investigations also is embedded in the disadvantages that conditions of colonialism and war and militarism have created and situated children within today. So we also have to look at our questions around childhood vis-a-vis the kinds of disadvantages that currently engulf children, in a sense. Yeah, that's my very long-winded answer, sorry, to a very short question. Yeah, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I think Anandini sort of addressed Chandni's question more satisfactorily. But from where I come in, I just want to say that given my work with the missionary archives, which I would think the Christian missionaries in some ways are the precursors to the modern NGOs doing development work in the sector of education, care, fostering, and so on. And I wouldn't know about the transdisciplinary part of your question, but these sites of care work, of fostering, of education, I mean, of course, historians have, often talked about these missionary enterprises, but the kind of work that I am doing in the sources, in the archives, also show how these become very important crucibles and very, very massive crucibles of interaction between of transgenerational encounters, transgenerational, transracial encounters, which also need to be reckoned with, rather than just talking about the colonial states' agendas or imperial anxieties about race. And I think once I realized how enmeshed Anandini, Shruti, and my journeys are in a certain sense, especially after CCYSC happened to us. Shruti once told me that she found in the archives at Princeton a letter written by a child from India, and I would find very similar examples of since we began with the seduction of the child's voice or children's voices, as horrendous as that sounds now in retrospect. But the archives also yield something like this when you look at care work or development work from the early 20th century, where pen pal-like initiatives were being set up by missionaries, asking children from different parts of Britain or Germany or Switzerland to write to children in certain parts of India, in Ceylon, and so on. And this is something which the NGO sector does even now, I'm told. Sometimes when and this from a lot of the UN's initiatives as well, that how when you have to support a child or sponsor a child in the global south, people usually receive, who are supporting, providing funding, they receive a postcard and handwritten letters and photographs and everyday accounts, sort of like tokens, a sort of acknowledgement of the funding that is given to them, the support that is shown to them. And that kind of work excites me as well. So I just, coming from a very different end, I was thinking that the NGO sector could also be similarly very important, seen as a very important crucible within which certain kinds of interactions unfold, which are very different from how spaces like school or the family would, set the tone for transgenerational interactions. So yeah, that's my 2 bits. More questions, anyone?
Are there any more questions from the audience? Smruthi, would you like to give any closing comments? Do you have something to add to the discussion?
It's just been thrilling to think with everyone in this group about the fluidity and the transforming, the dynamic nature of sociology of childhood. And I think the question about NGOs that Chandini Basu has raised also brings us to think about the sociology of childhood, not as just an academic silo that we're working with, but as something that's much more connected and fluid and changing and shaping the symbiotic relationships that it sits within in the broader context of thinking with and about children and childhood. Yeah, I think that would be my thought. Rituparna, I think you're muted.
You're muted, but you're thanking us. We can make that out.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you for the engaging and wonderful conversation today, and to all the audience members for joining and engaging as well. Hia, Anandini and Smruthi, really, really thankful. I know Anandini was still coughing, not very well, but again, thank you for making it. And the recording will later be uploaded on our blog. So if you have missed any part of it, you can catch it there.
Thank you so much, Rituparna.
Thank you so much.
It's a delight to be here and talk to my colleagues.
It was, thank you, Dipali and Rituparna. It was a real honor to be here and to be able to do this as well. So thanks for having us in the first place.
Yeah, as we can see, I think our co-founder, Professor Maitri Chaudhary, was trying to join the discussion, but probably there's some issue with her internet, so she's been unable to. But she'll catch up with.
She's here for this. Yeah, Professor Chaudhary is here, and thank you once again to all the speakers and the audiences for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thanks.
Thanks to Doing Sociology for making the space for us. Thank you.